The breaking news, the Secretary of the U.S. Navy is out as Trump's war with Iran enters day 54. The surprise announcement coming just moments ago from the Pentagon. Multiple sources telling CNN that there were tensions for months between John Phelan and the Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. Phelan was then told at this moment during the war, resign or be fired. And I mentioned during the war. I mean, this is a major move at a shocking time. This is the Secretary of the Navy, and the U.S. Navy right now has 15 ships in the Middle East, with most enforcing the biggest blockade by the United States since World War II. Phelan's sudden departure coming as it comes as we have new video tonight from Iranian state media purportedly showing soldiers seizing container ships in the Strait of Hormuz. Kristen, what are you learning? Obviously, as we said, you think about the scale of this blockade and what the United States Navy is doing right now. Suddenly, the Secretary of the Navy out with a resign or be fired.
Yeah, that's right. Obviously not good for the Secretary of the Navy. And we're learning some new reporting. And you mentioned some of this, which is this idea that there was tension between Pete Hegseth and Phalen. A lot of it stemming from Hegseth wanting him to be quicker, thinking it was too slow on ship reform. But there's another part of this that I think is key. And this is what is always key in a Trump White House, which is proximity to power. And the reason being that Hegseth was annoyed by Phalen because Phalen would go directly to President Trump. Now, remember this. Phalen was not somebody with military experience. He was a donor. He and his wife had raised millions of dollars for President Trump. He had a personal relationship with President Trump. And in Trump's White House, even the top branches of government, the top cabinet officials know that the closer you are in the direct line to Donald Trump, that gives you all of the power. So Hegseth felt like Phalen was going around him, having these direct conversations with President Trump. Now, we're still not entirely sure what option that Phalen went with, whether he resigned or was fired. But of course, we know now he was ousted after these personal tensions amid this ongoing war where the Navy is a central component.
I mean, it is obviously incredible timing. Kristen, thank you very much. Everyone is here with me. General Mark Schwartz, let me just start with you because you spent so much of your military career in the Middle East with special forces. So, the context of this, Phalen out, all this with a resign or be fired, as the reporting is, suddenly in the midst of this massive blockade, at least 15 ships involved in it. I mean, what is the impact of something like that at the Secretary of the Navy at a moment like this?
Well, I think the impact is greater from, an outsider's view of, like you said, the Navy Secretary being removed during a time of war. Down at the CENTCOM level and certainly below that in terms of operations day to day in the Gulf and the CENTCOM area of responsibility, not as big of an impact. But I think the optic, certainly for our enemies, Iran, seeing this, just like they saw the ousting of the Army Chief of Staff a couple of weeks ago, I think has an impact in terms of there's some instability inside of the department.
Laura, you've covered Iran for more than 20 years. Obviously, you're senior editor at The Atlantic. When the general talks about how this lands in Tehran, when they look at something like this, what is the significance of that? Someone who's at the top of the U.S. Navy, the optics of that being out.
Yeah, it's not a great look, especially not at a time when there's sort of so much confusion about what the U.S. objectives seem to be and where its red lines lie in advance of these negotiations. It does project a bit of chaos.
Brett, as you've been involved with negotiations with Iran during both the Obama and Biden administrations, and you've been in the rooms where the negotiations happen, what do you think the impact of something like this is? Obviously there is a bit of an irony, right, in the fact that we're being told no one knows who's running things in Tehran when the U.S. is doing things like just kicking out its Secretary of the Navy in the midst of the biggest blockade in 70 years.
Yeah, and I agree with Mark. It's not going to affect, I think, the operational element of the blockade. But what the U.S. is trying to project right now to Iran is that we're settling into a steady state of economic pressure, mounting economic pressure. We're going to have this blockade in place. We got 3 carrier strike groups. We're settling in. So to have your Navy Secretary ousted or resigning right as that's happening does not, I think, it doesn't send a signal of confidence. And Iran will read it. They're looking for any indication that they can wiggle out of this. And they'll read it as kind of an opening and maybe the administration is not as cohesive. One thing that might be happening behind the scenes, I mean, the Navy Secretary is focused, Aaron, on force management, global force management. And I'm sure there is a debate in the administration as we have this massive resource focus on the Middle East that affects readiness in other parts of the globe. That's probably part of the debate, might be part of it, but we don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. General Schwartz, all that is really crucial, not just in terms of force positioning, but also the weapons that have been used, right, and everything, given, obviously, we've talked about what this all means for China. But what does this mean also for Pete Hegseth? You know, there had been discussion as to whether there was any wavering in the president's commitment to Hegseth at various moments. But this would appear that this sort of came down to it's me or him. And Hegseth won.
Certainly, the secretary has the full confidence of the president. I mean, every time that they're in public together, whether it's the formal briefings or, you know, at the White House when they have their updates, obviously the security updates, the president speaks very highly of the secretary and, you know, demonstrates that he has full confidence in how he's carrying out the war. So whether it's a consolidation of power, I really can't assess that. But certainly, you know, he's the one that brought that recommendation to the president, and the president approved it.
Laura, you know, Barak Ravid was reporting from a U.S. government source that there's real questions about whether the Supreme Leader, Mohammad Khamenei, is incapacitated. You know, whether he's, you know, in a sense, it wasn't even a point about alive or dead. It's whether he can be involved in any way, shape, or form, which could be crucial. Where do you think we are with the Supreme Leader right now? We obviously haven't seen him in the 54 days of this war either.
Right. No, there are legitimate questions to be raised here, and in this length of time to have seen nothing that would indicate that he is functioning in the way that one would expect the Supreme Leader to be functioning is a sign that something is not as it's been presented. There's a lot of unknowns, obviously, and one of them is, to the extent that the Supreme Leader is an individual, but is also an office in Iran. There is a whole institution that undergirds the Supreme Leader. It's got about 4,000 employees at headquarters and maybe 10 times that across the country. So it's not just a question of, is Moshtaba Khamenei himself making every decision personally, but is this bureaucracy functioning? Who is running it? And to the extent that it is or isn't, what does that mean for the balance of factional forces inside the Iranian regime? Because those forces have always been there. It's a country without political parties, but with politics. And the office of the leader in certain times was a sort of balancing and juggling.
An arbiter of some sort.
Allegedly.
Allegedly. But it's interesting you say 40,000 people work. The bureaucracy of the Supreme Leader's office of itself. Yeah. Brett, you know, would you talk about who's making the decisions here? And I know that the White House has talked about all these factions that are going on. And now there's talk about the former Quds Force leader, General Vahidi, who is obviously chief of the IRGC, that perhaps he is essentially calling the shots. What do you know of him?
Well, he goes back a long ways. You know, he was sanctioned in the Obama administration in 2010 for having connections to the nuclear program.